Should we stop negotiations, pull a no deal, and leave the EU on World Trade Organization terms?
No deal is better than a bad deal.
Could it be a way out of this mess if Parliament changes its mind or simply doesn't make a decision in time? Once again, I'll be looking at this from three angles: the impact on the country as a whole, the impact on the Westminster bubble, and finally, the impact on the EU. Even if you don't agree with me, consider subscribing by the end of the video. So the impact on the UK as a whole. There's no doubting people who voted to remain in the EU in 2016 would be seriously upset should the UK choose to pull a no deal. How upset they would be would all depend on whether the government actively chose World Trade Organization terms, or unless incompetency meant nothing else could be agreed by the time the deadline, which is currently the 12th of April, is reached. To actively choose to go with the no deal would mean amending the Spellman amendment when MPs voted against no deal. Or to put it another way, they voted in favour of always at least leaving with a deal at the very least. MPs have already rejected the Malthouse compromise, which was the idea to have a managed no deal that involved a transition period. So it still seems unlikely a chosen no deal would actually happen. But running out of time is certainly still a possibility. Once again, people could react on a scale from silently protesting in the next election to full-blown riots. But what I failed to mention in my last video is the geographic and cultural divisions that could also be created. Scotland would likely want independence.
The choice is not between this deal and no deal, despite what the government spin machine may say. The reality is that if we are to secure a better outcome than is currently on offer, then the only option is to look beyond the current draft withdrawal agreement and work in the time ahead for an improved outcome.
Northern Ireland, who would have to accept tariffs on imports, would be seriously annoyed, and EU citizens within the UK would feel extremely isolated. The government has already forecast that the UK economy would be 6.3 to 9% worse off than remaining in the EU over a 15-year period in a no-deal scenario. If the UK didn't come up with a plan to further extend Article 50 or revoke Article 50 by 11 p.m. on the 12th of April, then the trade deals that the EU has with the rest of the world would instantly fail to apply to the UK and would instantly have to be remade, giving the opportunity to make trade deals more accustomed to the UK economy and therefore beneficial to the UK itself. But the UK would also have access to a much smaller world market, with the countries nearby having to impose tariffs on goods crossing our borders.
We truly hope that a no-deal Brexit will be avoided, and in fact, that is the whole wish of the whole world.
Custom checks could create delays, but in its own way, it could create more jobs at the border. This could lead to a rise in the cost of living and lead to something that's only going to make the public even angrier. Northern Ireland would have to impose tariffs at the border, and that could lead to businesses moving to the Republic. UK nationals could travel throughout the Schengen area for up to 90 days, but they would be unable to undertake paid activity, and they would not be able to use the European passporting lanes anymore. But unlike endlessly trying to get a deal, leaving without a deal at least gives businesses the certainty about what the UK relationship with the EU actually is. The UK government has already put £4.1 billion in preparation for Brexit, and some of that goes towards a no-deal scenario. The UK government will recognise EU hauler licences to ease transition at the border. The UK will also recognise the batch testing of medicines to prevent delays in the supply of medicines to the UK. HMRC and Calais have even said they would not need any more checks within the UK in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But the UK government would be preoccupied dealing with the border infrastructure. It's estimated 5.3 thousand extra civil servants, as well as £250 million a year, will be needed in the event of a no deal, according to HMRC, to make trade across the border quick and easy. And that could mean other problems the UK faces, such as knife crime and the NHS, take a back seat. This might make those who voted to remain even angrier, and although the UK could keep calm and carry on, the political instability might grind the economy to a halt. Having said that, being outside a customs union would mean the UK could quickly make trade deals with nations around the world, driving investment into the UK economy and potentially creating jobs. As long as the lowering of food standards doesn't outcompete domestic farmers, as the current government no-deal plans have already promised.
This is now a battle of people versus the politicians. For the first time in the history of our great country, we have a parliament ignoring the will of the people. It's a betrayal, it's a total disgrace.
But a United Kingdom which didn't honour international commitments and disregarded things like the Good Friday Agreement, and a UK that ultimately has access to less trading countries in the geography around it, might put off future investors into our country. Just as with remaining in the EU, and in fact more so, the country and MPs would have to work especially hard to keep the economy afloat and trading fluid. There's every chance that this wartime-like spirit could unite the country and create a positive effect on the national happiness rather than a negative one. Unlike remaining in the EU, which ultimately comes after the mess of trying to leave only to reverse that mess, leaving the EU on no-deal terms does achieve what Parliament have been struggling to achieve for the past 3 years. It would be a people's victory. Let's not forget that the vote last week, which ensured that leaving on World Trade Organization terms ever, was lost, but it was lost by only 4 votes. That's almost a majority in Parliament, which means it's likely that leaving on no-deal terms won't be the crash out, oops, we ran out of time scenario it's often portrayed as, but in fact a deliberate decision to leave the EU with a form of hard Brexit when there's no other logical option.
We do respect the vote of British people. We do respect what the Prime Minister and the Parliament are making. But we have to be clear. We can discuss and agree on an extension, if this is a technical extension, in case of a yes vote on the agreement we negotiated during 2 years. In case of no vote or no, directly, it will guide everybody to a no deal, for sure.
The EU, especially Macron, aren't willing to negotiate again, or if they are, it's only to negotiate a softer Norway-style Brexit, which means accepting even more EU ruling over the UK, effectively not giving the UK the benefits of leaving. No deal, at least, draws a big, fat, definitive line that still points in the same direction that we've been going in all this time, and it's instantaneous. A managed no deal might even involve a transition period to assist in all the negatives I've just mentioned.
We are on the verge of making a historic mistake. And I just say this, unless we change course, we are going to stay in the customs union, we're going to stay in the single market, and we're going to be rules takers. And unless we junk this backstop, we are going to find that Brussels has got us exactly where they want us.
Westminster. Theresa May has always said that no deal is better than a bad deal. If we were leaving the EU without a deal, especially without the deal that she's been negotiating for the last 2 years, her position would most likely be done. Then all eyes would turn towards Chris Grayling and his failed seaborne freight contract and the entire government's lack of preparation for a no-deal scenario.
Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, claimed the government had looked very carefully at seaborne freight before giving the company the contract, but apparently not carefully enough to notice it didn't have any ships.
Labour, who are against leaving without a deal, would be happy to call for a general election on a failed government, and there's every chance those disgruntled Remainers would look towards a political party who would want to get us back into the EU, and there's every chance that they could win. The UK could be choosing to go back into the EU the month after the UK left without a deal. As for the Conservatives, the Tory voters would be very happy that Brexit was being delivered. But let's face it, they were trying to get the withdrawal agreement through for the last 2 years, so who knows how they would be betrayed by the British electorate and what would happen to them in a future election. One thing that is clearer is that all the preparations for leaving without a deal are already partially done. Now the opposition will naturally say they're not done enough. The Tories will say, well, at least we had a plan, while you, Labour, who might be in government at the time, do not. Having said that, the lack of substantiality in planning and economics of what will happen in the event of a no-deal scenario might perpetually keep Parliament from voting against a no-deal. The MPs who've been saying that no deal is not so bad all along will likely rise to the front benches of the Conservative Party. The SNP would likely want to hold a second Scottish referendum because Scotland voted to remain in the original 2016 referendum, and there would need to be planning on how to deal with the border and trade and run the rest of the country simultaneously, which is where an application to the EU to enter into a form of transition period might come in place, along with other basic stripped-down deal planning. The government's priority would be to restore a devolved parliament instalment to be able to deal with the sudden change in economic and political circumstance surrounding the border. The EU, along with the UK, would be expected to respect the Good Friday Agreement and not impose infrastructure at that border, and under World Trade Organization rules, there is no rule meaning that you have to. But it does break international discrimination rules by giving preference to the Republic of Ireland to access the UK's markets over the rest of the world, meaning that the rest of the world can claim they're being discriminated against, and it would therefore break up the UK's international relationships. The mainstream media throughout the world would likely focus all on Britain, and we'd either be the laughingstock of the world or would be the trigger that breaks the EU's back. It would all depend on how pragmatic our politicians perform when faced with the pressure of mitigating economic damage. If the economic forecasts turn out not to be true, it would embarrass media outlets throughout the world. But if our economy turns out worse than the media suggested, then the media would gain, and world populism would lessen.
UK government will still have a choice of a deal, no deal, a long extension, or revoking Article 50. The 12th of April is a key date in terms of the UK deciding whether to hold European Parliament elections. If it has now decided to do so by then, the option of a long extension will automatically become impossible.
The EU. Without being an EU member or even accepting any deal the EU offered, the EU could impose tariffs and regulatory checks on goods crossing into the trading bloc. They could, if they wanted to, seriously damage the UK economy. However, one has to remember the Republic of Ireland geographically relies on the UK for importing goods. If the EU is mean to the UK could equally reply and cut off all exports to the EU, effectively shutting off a large chunk of the Irish economy and making it harder to get goods from mainland Europe to the island of Ireland. No deal itself would be a huge cost to the EU. They would have to employ more customs officials and infrastructure too, as well as the UK, to check UK goods entering their countries. The EU has said flights between the UK and the EU, but not between member states, and haulage certificates will continue. According to the IMF, the EU can expect a 1.5% loss in growth over the next 5 years in the event of a no-deal scenario. Ireland would expect a 3.8% loss, and the UK would expect a 4% loss. So Ireland might well become a hostage partner to gaining access into the EU's markets in the event of a no-deal scenario. And this might increase tensions on the island of Ireland. 6.5 billion euros would no longer be paid towards the EU. So it seems like no deal is mostly negatives all round, but leaving without a deal still has major support across the entire country, continent and world as a whole. It really is the Russian roulette scenario in these negotiations. But do you agree with me? Should we leave the EU without a deal? Join in the debate below and subscribe.